Welcome back to lecture part two of the endocrine system, chapter 13. So we talked basically about what the endocrine system is, what hormones were, how they move through the body and the bloodstream. We compared them to some other substances that are secreted throughout the body, your nervous system, paracrine secretions, autocrine secretions. Now let's start getting more specific and learning more about um, how all of this stuff fits together. So let's first talk about steroid and thyroid hormones. Remember that your steroid hormones are made up of a cholesterol backbone. Cholesterol is a type of lipid or fat in the body. Thyroid hormones are very similar. So because they are lipid backed, they have poor water solubility. Basically, water and oil don't mix. So, in order to be able to be transmitted, transported, transferred throughout the body in this aqueous solution, and please know aqueous means water, aqueous, Aqueous, I think that's how it's spelled. It is floating around through this aqueous solution, this water-based solution, so it's not going to move around the body easily because otherwise it would just float on the edges of the water. It'll basically get um, pushed against the side of the vessels, probably not going very far because it's pushed against the walls of the blood vessels. So, in order for that not to happen, what the body does is it binds those steroid hormones to proteins, other proteins that are found dissolved in the plasma. So, because they are now bound to the plasma, I'm sorry, bound to the proteins in the blood plasma, they're able to go throughout the body freely. So think about this like you have somebody who is trying to get into a club and they either are not dressed right, they're not the type of person, they don't have enough money, whatever it is, they can't get into the club. But you have somebody that will vouch for them, right? And so that person can go in and out of the club at will. It can intermingle with the other people that's inside the club, outside the club. That would be the plasma protein. Once that person grabs the hand of the person that couldn't get in and says, I vouch for them, they can get in, they can hold their hand and walk them throughout any aspect of the club because they are bound together. Once they release the hand, they don't know who this person is, they might not let them in, right? So these lipid lipid based or cholesterol based hormones need to be bound by plasma proteins in order to get through the plasma and into its target cell. Once the steroid hormone gets to the target cell, it doesn't have any problem. It can just diffuse through the membrane because remember, cell membranes are lipid bilayers. So because the cell membrane is made up of a lipid and steroid hormones are made up of lipids, these steroid hormones can easily cross the lipid membrane. Whereas the other types of hormones that are not steroid hormones, the non-steroid hormones, they can't pass through as easily because they are not lipid friendly. They cannot just move across the membrane. Um, so keep that in mind. So moving on, thyroid hormones, even though they are not steroid hormones, they still don't move like your non-steroid hormones. So, thyroid hormones are thought to enter the cell by specific transport methods, meaning that they need a special way to get uh, in and out of a cell, even though it's not a steroid hormone. Both types of hormones, your steroid and your thyroid hormones, will bind to receptors inside the cell. Remember that these are hormones that have diffused through the lipid bilayer, so they find themselves inside the cell. Now, once they get in the cell, the receptor that's already inside the cell can then bind to that hormone and the reaction can occur. These receptors that are inside the cell are usually in the nucleus, right? Or in the nucleus, on the nuclear membrane. So this hormone was outside of the cell. It diffused, it moved across that cell membrane and is able to just float around in the cell freely until it meets up with the receptor that is also inside the cell, usually inside the nucleus. Once that receptor and the hormone bind together, it will cause transcription of some part of the DNA. So remember, it is communicating with the cell. It is telling the cell to do something or to stop doing something. And in these cases, it is causing transcription of some part of the DNA inside that cell. Remember that the receptors are in the nucleus, and the nucleus is what houses your DNA. So once that hormone gets inside the nucleus and binds to that receptor, then the signal, the communication is, let's start making products from this particular part of the DNA, this particular blueprint of the DNA. And that's protein synthesis. So we're actually going to make some type of protein from this DNA sequence that will then lead to the action of the hormone. So we already talked about how they both, wait, nope, I didn't move forward. Sorry about that. All right. So again, visual learners, if you need a condensed version of what we just talked about, check this out. And this is your visual of a steroid hormone. So steroid hormone, because it's lipid-based, cell membrane is lipid-based, the steroid hormone can just move on through the membrane and then float throughout the cell. Eventually, it'll find its way in the nucleus because this is also made up of lipids. This membrane, the nuclear membrane, is also made up of lipids. The steroid can then move through the nuclear membrane and go into the nucleus. It will bind to the receptor that is inside the nucleus. And once it binds, you have the hormone receptor complex that will then cause transcription or the reading of part of this DNA strand that will then make some product. And that product, here is what the example of that is. That product will then cause some changes in the cell, around the cell. It will cause some kind of change. Non-steroid hormones cannot penetrate that lipid bilayer of the cell membranes because they are not made up of lipids. Remember, these are made up of amino acid backbone, peptides, proteins, and glycoproteins, none of which are lipids and none of which are lipid soluble. So they, non-steroid hormones, will bind to the receptor on the membrane, the outer membrane of that target cell. In this case, the hormone is considered the first messenger. So the hormone um, wants to tell the cell to do something. We need a relay team of messengers in order to get that message inside the cell because the hormone cannot get into the cell because of the lipid bilayer. So it is considered the first messenger. Once that hormone binds to the receptor on the cell membrane, then on the other side of that receptor that's actually inside the cell, that part of the receptor will then go in and say, all right, let's move. And it will cause a second messenger to then send the signals to the various aspect of the cell that is then going to do some work. Um, For many hormones, that second messenger is called cyclic adenosine monophosphate. You'll see it and hear it as cyclic AMP or CAMP. Occasionally, you may hear somebody call it CAMP, but that is what it is. That is cyclic adenosine monophosphate. Now, you've heard of some parts of this. If you haven't heard of this molecule before, you've heard of some parts of it. Adenosine monophosphate. Though you may not recognize adenosine monophosphate, AMP, if you add a phosphate, so monophosphate means there's one phosphate, you add a phosphate, then you get diphosphate, adenosine diphosphate. This should start sounding more familiar. When you add another phosphate, you have then adenosine triphosphate. That is ATP and ADP. So AMP is basically the same molecule. You have two less phosphates, one or two less phosphates than the other molecules. All right. So cyclic AMP is basically a version of ATP with two of the phosphate groups removed. This then acts as a second messenger, a messenger on the other side, the internal side of the receptor to then send a signal. The entire process of communication from outside of the cell to the inside of the cell, that whole process is called signal transduction. So this is the visual, the artistic visual of what that looks like. So now you have your non-steroid hormone molecule. Remember, it cannot get through because it is not made up of a lipid. So this lipid bilayer is not going to let it pass through. It actually has to bind to a receptor on the surface that is embedded in the membrane of the cell. Once it binds to that membrane, the other side, the side on the internal aspect of the membrane, is then changed so that the reaction can occur. ATP eventually is broken down into AMP, cyclic AMP. And then once this receptor binds here, that cyclic AMP is then told to go do your job. And so it is the second messenger that will cause other things to happen in the body. For example, here it says that protein kinase is inactive, cyclic AMP then activates it. So then you have some kind of cellular changes. That's an example of what happens. All right, so clinical application. Let's talk about how this can work in the body. So sometimes you hear you hear talk of people abusing steroids in order to improve some type of athletic performance. So, or use hormones. So some of the hormones that can be abused, you have your steroids, you have growth hormone, you have erythropoietin. Steroids, excuse me, they're used to increase muscular strength because remember your steroid hormones, some of your steroid hormones are your sex hormones. So testosterone, estrogen, progesterone. So typically, it will be the testosterone that is injected. People will take testosterone and inject it in order to increase muscular strength, increase muscle size, right? But it can have some harmful side effects, such as decreasing your natural testosterone production. So your body is very efficient in many ways. If you actually have your body's actually producing some substance, then once you start injecting it or putting it into the body in levels that are above what the body is making, your body says, okay, I don't need to produce this. It shuts down its own production of the thing because you are receiving it external to that organ. So, if a person then decides to stop taking that steroid hormone, then they have trouble because their body is no longer producing it or no longer producing it at the levels that it used to be, and they start to feel awful. It can also stunt growth. So if a person is still growing, it's someone who has not finished growing yet, they take testosterone. It can make them shorter. It can cause moobs or man boobs, breast development in males. It can cause male sexual characteristics in females like bigger muscles, hairier body, so more facial hair, more chest hair, etc., deepening of the voice, those types of things. It can cause damage to the kidneys, liver, heart, increase bad cholesterol, and cause mental emotional problems. I'm sure you've heard of roid rage, where people just start flying off the handle for a very little bit of stimulation because they're on testosterone. So that's what happened with steroids. Growth hormone can also be used to enlarge the muscles. It can be used instead of hormones or along with the steroid hormones. And erythropoietin, remember erythro means red. Erythropoietin is a substance that your body naturally makes that helps to make more red blood cells. So if you inject erythropoietin, then that can increase the number of red blood cells that your body produces. Now, what will that do? That will help your muscles recover faster, because if you have more red blood cells, then you have more oxygen carrying capacity, which means that you have more oxygen delivered to the muscles. Remember, the reason why we get oxygen to cells is to produce ATP. So that cellular respiration is to produce ATP. And the more oxygen you have, the more ATP can be produced. And so if you have higher amounts of oxygen in the cells, because you have higher amounts of red blood cells, then you have greater athletic performance, because now you have more energy for those muscles to perform. Erythropoietin can also be used to treat certain types of anemia. If a person, anemia is basically a condition where there's little red blood cells. So A and an mean no, and emia is blood. So the word literally means no blood. So if a person has low red blood cell count, then erythropoietin can help the person to produce more red blood cells. Prostaglandins. So prostaglandins are a type of paracrine substance. Prostaglandins are a type of paracrine substance. Paracrine substances, remember, they act locally. These are very potent in small amounts, just like your hormones. These are not actually stored inside the cell. They are synthesized just before they are released from the paracrine cells. Um, and Just like they are made as needed, they are inactivated shortly after they are used. These help to regulate the response of the cells to your hormones. They can either activate or inhibit adenylate cyclase. Anytime you see ASE at the end of a word, know that that is an enzyme. So adenylate cyclase is an enzyme that helps to control cyclic AMP production, that second messenger. So these prostaglandins can either activate adenylate cyclase or inhibit adenylate cyclase to either increase or decrease the amount of cyclic AMP that is floating around in a cell, which then will change how that cell responds to the hormone that it needs to respond to. It's either going to help increase or decrease that response. Prostaglandins have a wide variety of effects, such as contracting or relaxing smooth muscles, stimulating or inhibiting secretion, etc. So those are prostaglandins. All right. Hormone secretion and effects. The secretion is precisely regulated. Hormones, because they're so powerful, even in small amounts, they need to be highly, highly regulated in the body. There's lots of checks and balances to make sure that the body is not over or under producing hormones, um, so that we have just the right amount produced for our needs. Hormone secretion is primarily controlled by negative feedback. If you do not know what negative feedback is, please make sure you look it up, or when you come to class, let's discuss. Its effects can be short-lived, or it may last for days. So effects of these hormone secretions can be a couple minutes to a couple days, a few days. Some of your hormones are excreted in the urine. Once they serve their function, they're excreted in the urine. Some can be broken down by enzymes, mainly from the liver, to stop their effects. So, a couple different ways that you can get rid of hormones once they've done their job. Excretion through urine, broken down by enzymes, mainly in the liver. All right. So we said negative feedback and positive feedback. We talked about negative feedback, how predominantly negative feedback is what's used to control and regulate your hormones. So, negative feedback and positive feedback. Negative feedback, basically the way it works. Negative feedback, your body is saying, we have some changes occurring in our environment, either internal or external environment. We don't like these changes, so we want to stop it as quickly as possible. All right. We want to get back to normal, get back to homeostasis as quickly as possible. So I'm going to do what I can to hurry up and get back to where I want to be. That's negative feedback. Positive feedback says, all right, we finally have the changes that we want. Let's make these changes stronger. We want this to occur until the desired function happens. All right. So, negative feedback is a control mechanism in which rising levels of a hormone lead to a decrease in hormone secretion. So, the more a hormone is being produced, then the body then goes back to the organ that produced it, either one or two organs that above, and say, you can stop production now. We have enough of this hormone. We don't need you to produce anymore. So as the hormone is used up, the inhibition stops, and the secretion begins again. Think about it like you have a store that is only allowed to have 20 people in. So, and you have 150 people that want to get in this store. Well, then you need somebody on the outside of the store and count people. So you let 20 people in. Now we're going to inhibit how many more people come in. So once one person leaves, another person can go in. But once you have 20, we're stopping. We're not letting anybody else in to buy anything else because it'll be too much, right? We only want a certain amount in there. So as the hormone is used up, the inhibition stops and we can start to secrete that hormone again. The main methods of control for hormone secretion. This negative feedback is the main method of control of secretion of your hormones. You have three methods of negative feedback control for hormone secretion. You have control of the hypothalamus, you have nervous system control, and then you have changes in the internal environment itself. The hypothalamus controls the release of hormones from the anterior pituitary. Remember when we talked about the hypothalamus, or we sort of went over it, we saw that they were releasing hormones, inhibiting hormones. So these are not the hormones that actually the other um, organs are going to use. These are the hormones that actually tell the other organs start or stop producing their product. All right. So hypothalamus controls the release of anterior pituitary hormones. Anterior pituitary then will secrete hormones that control activity of other glands. The anterior pituitary is called the master gland because it controls the activity of other glands. The hypothalamus controls the activity of the pituitary. The pituitary controls the activity of other glands. Tropic hormones are the hormones that act on other glands. So your pituitary will secrete these tropic hormones that will control the activity of other glands. You will see that word tropic in the names of many hormones because the tropic hormones are the ones that are acting on other glands. So that's how the hypothalamus can control hormone secretion. Nervous system control. The nervous system directly stimulates some of the glands to secrete their hormones through nerve impulses. So the nervous system can send an impulse. The effector of that, remember that effectors in the nervous system are glands or muscles, right? So in this particular case, the nervous system effector is the gland, and that nerve is telling that gland to either do a thing or stop doing a thing. Then you have changes in the composition of the internal environment, changing levels of a specific substance in the blood, for example, some kind of ion, change the level of glucose, etc., will either stimulate or inhibit the secretion of certain hormones. For example, you have glucose. You eat a meal, and as you eat the meal goes down your digestive system. It starts to break down into smaller and smaller parts. You then have amino acids from the proteins that you've eaten. You have glucose from the carbohydrates you've eaten, etc. That glucose is then moved from the digestive system into the body. It eventually gets into the bloodstream, and now you have an increase in um, glucose molecules in the bloodstream. That is a change in the internal environment because the environment of the bloodstream is now changed by an increase in glucose. That increase in glucose floating around in the blood will then stimulate the production of insulin. It will inhibit the production of glucagon. Both of those are hormones that are used to control how much glucose is in the blood, right? So a change in the internal environment of the blood will then either stimulate or inhibit the production of certain hormones. All of those are negative feedback. Positive feedback. I mentioned that positive feedback. You have a change in the environment, and then the body wants to continue with that change to produce a desired outcome. So, control mechanism in which rising levels of a hormone will lead to an increase in the secretion of that hormone. These are used in a small number of cases of hormone control, especially in the reproductive system. For example, the hormones that will cause contraction. So you have a pregnant mom who is in the last few days of her pregnancy. The hormone that is responsible for the contraction of the uterus to start to expel the baby, the hormone that is responsible for the dilation of the cervix. Dilation, remember, it means opening or widening. So widening of the cervix or opening of the cervix in order for the baby to be kicked out of the uterus. Once those hormone levels increase, the body says, all right, we're really tired of having this baby in. Let's increase those numbers even more until the baby is kicked out of the uterus, until the baby is sent through the birth canal and now the baby is on its own outside of the body. That is then when those hormones will stop being produced. So that's the difference between negative feedback and positive feedback. And we will stop here and continue on the next video.